are aware.
Cool.
So Deborah, this is a back-to-back for me and Jennifer. Last night we were on a dialogue with an organization called Reimagine that looks at sort of communities' reimagination around death and dying. And we did one on Ballroom as well, and Jennifer did excellent as she always does. But we are doing a double header.
All right now, I can't imagine that she would do anything but that.
That's it.
So without further ado, I am going to start this process. So good evening, everyone. My name is Deborah Levine, and I am the director of the Harlem Health Initiative for the SUNY School of Public Health and Health Policy. And it gives me distinct pleasure this evening to bring two intelligent, fabulous, truly insightful individuals to have a conversation to set the tone for Pride, which is June. And I can't believe that we are already in June 2021. I am absolutely amazed by the fact that we have made it this far. In light of that, I do ask that before I start this process, that we do take a moment and acknowledge those who are with us in spirit, but may have transitioned, to all the soldiers who have fought the hard fight. Yeah, so I'm gonna decrease so that we can get started in this absolutely phenomenal process. Hold on, let me get all of this together. And without further ado, we're gonna watch a clip between Dr. Jennifer Lee and Michael Roberson. And after that, we're gonna open the floor for questions and answers. I would ask that you please keep your mics off, but if you'd like, you're more than welcome to turn your cameras on. Please use the chat, and we will be taking questions and answers and having conversation as soon as we complete the video. Agreed? All right.
Good evening. My name is Dr. Jennifer Lee. Welcome to our discussion. Ballroom has something to say about being human and the struggle for freedom in the face of catastrophe. Between two pandemics, a ballroom protocol of becoming, a hegemony and resistance discourse, and a Kairos moment of reckoning. I am so honored to be joined by my father, ballroom icon and Hall of Famer, Michael Roberson, tonight. Michael is a public health practitioner, advocate, activist, artist, curator, and leader within the LGBTQ+ community. He is the co-creator of the nation's only Black gay research group and National Black Gay Men's Advocacy Coalition, as well as an adjunct professor at the New School University, Lane College, New York City, and Union Theological Seminary, New York City. He is an international art and politics consultant and a member of the international sound art collective entitled Ultra Red. Michael is also a scholar in residence for the Center for Race, Religion, and Economic Democracy, as well as a recent TED Media resident, where he performed a global TED Talk about the underground Black Latinx house ball and ballroom community entitled The Enduring Legacy of Ballroom. Michael also serves as a cultural consultant for the Pose FX television show. And additionally, he is a public health advisor and community engagement specialist for the New York City COVID-19 Contract Tracing Initiative. With all that said, hi, Father Michael. It's so nice to have you. Did I forget anything else about your bio, or would you like to add anything before we jump into some of the questions tonight?
No, I think, first of all, you read it so wonderfully. It was so smooth, like the flow of Niagara Falls. So,
Thank you. So tonight, I'm going to ask you a few questions. We have a lot of objectives to meet tonight, but I just wanted to make sure that given that we have such a short time, I thought it would be best if I was able to ask you some questions and you could just share your wisdom, expertise, and knowledge with everyone tonight. So my first question for you is, marginalized by prejudice, violence, housing insecurity, and HIV infection rates, among other burdens, Black and Brown transgender and gender nonconforming people experience particular challenges in establishing secure, nourishing communities, both within the LGBTQ plus spaces and in society at large. Please tell me about the House and Ballroom community, a formidable social movement and creative collective for the LGBTQ persons of color in responding to such stigmas to form self-sustaining social networks.
that was a very loaded question, but a good one. And so let me back into sort of my relationship to how I was introduced to, and then sort of then do this a brief historical narrative. I originally from Camden, New Jersey, right? So Camden is a small inner city across the bridge from Philadelphia. And so I was born there, reared there, went to school there, went to college there, went to Rutgers University, applied to law school twice, and got accepted twice and put on a waiting list, and I got tired of waiting. And I began working for the Camden City Board of Education. So very interesting, as we're sitting here talking, this relationship between me entering, not getting into law school, be put on a waiting list, making a decision to, or getting a job working for the Board of Education, and how in many ways that entered me into Ballroom. So very interesting that what I'm going to say about that. And so I began working for the Kansas City Board of Education. And then I began working at two hospitals doing psychiatric emergency at the same time. And at the same time, I began facilitating a support discussion group for LGBT young folk of color at a Black gay indigenous organization called Colors. And so it was there in many ways that things began to ferment for me. There were some young folk who went to Camden High School where I worked who began to be part of my life. And as I was going out into community, being voyeuristic, if you will, around the house ballroom community, seeing folks in a club performing voguing, being in awe of it, not necessarily understanding that it was a cultural production of a historical community, not at all. Didn't even have the language to understand that. But also just seeing maybe 3-4 years prior, Paris's burning, so making these connections. But I entered into the houseball community through a couple of my kids, so following that. Even though I was out, even though I was around it longer, they gave me sort of the courage, if you will, to be a member. And so I began being part of the community in 1994, 95. Was a member of the House of Romeo Gilly, which is a small Philadelphia house. And then I left that house and became a member of the House of Ebony. House of Ebony was created in 1978 in Brooklyn, but I became a member of Philadelphia, excuse me. And then I left Ebony in 1999, early 2000, and me and my son, Damon Hughes, my good friend Preston, created a House of Blonick. And we intentionally created a house that we wanted to be a sort of intersection of both African Americans and Latinos. Because one of the things we noticed was there was a sort of dichotomy racially between the two in houseball community. And then I left that and created some other things. But I bring that up in that way to talk about this space of not when one door closes, that another door opens, and you oftentimes don't know why that door is open. So it was an unfolding of the universe, if you will, inviting me in to be part of this historical narrative, right? And so oftentimes when people hear ballroom, they think ballroom dancing, right? And so particularly people who are not part of the community. And so one of the things I oftentimes do is this sort of this real brief historical narrative that allows people to not only understand it, but make sort of these sort of connections, these dots to the history of it and why we are where we are today. But the house ballroom community really emerges out of the 1920s Harlem Renaissance. I oftentimes say that if not for slavery, if not for the Emancipation Proclamation, if not for after the Emancipation Proclamation and the creation of Black Reconstruction and its dismantle, and the rise of lynching as a form of social control, and the creation of the KKK, if not for Black folk in the southern part of the United States moving to New York, to the north, looking for a new home, we call it the Great Migration. If not during that time between 1919 and 1931, the creation of this sort of radical Black artistic political movement called the Harlem Renaissance. And in this space, and Harlem becomes our new home, in this space, folks became homeless in this new home. The Black church created a 3-decade campaign to get rid of Black queers in Harlem. There were 3 ways that Black queers congregated in Harlem, which was in beauty salons, in having rent parties, and this thing called drag balls. The drag balls become what I call a sort of both political but also a theological movement to be able to create a home for folk who were deemed homeless in the new space of freedom. And so when you think about sort of the migration of Black folk, and particularly around freedom movements, ballroom to me comes out of that same Black freedom movement. In fact, after World War II, where other cities become Blacker, Detroit, Philadelphia, Chicago, DC, these drag balls migrate to these spaces. But in 1967, there is a Black trans woman named Crystal LaBeija who resisted racism in the drag ball circuit. And she is at a drag ball. She protests because she talks about the notion that someone else wins who was white, and she thought it was everything to do with not only colorism, but also race. And there was a guy named Phil Black, who at the time was the only African-American performer who had a Screen Actors Guild card. And he says to Crystal, let's go back to an old circuit that we created in Harlem, and it's Black, and create our own movement again, if you will. And between 1967 and 1973, you began to see the morphing of a community that's not grounded just in performativity and just trans folks performing, but the creation of a house that becomes a politics. I oftentimes, let me push back on that. I oftentimes or think back on it. I oftentimes think about the way that we look at space, right, as geography. And we think of Harlem in this not only romantic, retrospective way, but as a space that is so huge. And Harlem really is a community that exists, of course, in Manhattan. And so you think about that north to south, Harlem's probably no more than 30 to 35 blocks north to south, and maybe 15, 16 blocks east to west. And so here you have in this space, so this political movement of folk organizing, right? That are borrowing from sort of the Black struggle for freedom during the 1960s as well. And so these trans women create a movement in many ways out of that. And so you begin to see the construction of houses. 1968, the very first house was created, the House of LaBeija. There were other houses that began to be created between 68 and 73. And 73 is important because that's the first time that a gay man participated in the house ball community. And so the construction of a house was now mother, father, and children who have been ostracized out of community, ostracized out of their own family, and needing home. And so the house has become sort of their home. But they're also, but this time is also in relationship to a lot of the artistic movements at the time. Hip hop was created, the very first hip hop party was created in 1973. And so the New Eureka Poet movement was created around the same time. I think about salsa as a sort of Afro, Puerto Rican, New Yorker, particularly jazz-infused artistic movement, looking at the disenfranchisement of a people both in Harlem and the Bronx. And so this is in relationship to those things. And so it was so important to be able to create such a project, if you will, these things called houses, because Ballroom is prophetic. Had no idea, but here's a prophecy of Ballroom that 9-10 years later, they would be confronted with sort of the AIDS crisis.
So my next question is, most current research really pathologizes the ballroom community in ways describing how the community just has a higher HIV prevalence and is disproportionately impacted by HIV and AIDS, or the epidemic. And little is really known or documented regarding the sociocultural challenges that ballroom members experience, and how they resist hegemony through their own embodied knowledge, community organizing, and practices inherent to the house and ballroom community. So I was just hoping you could describe a bit more about how the house and ballroom community is a space of organizing toward freedom, our own wellness, and moreover, in this moment, how does ballroom organize?
So I had to sit with that for a little bit, so excuse my pause. So I'm thinking about sort of reflecting on, excuse me, what this particular moment happens to be saying in 2021, right? So if one thinks about the 2020 ushered in our lifetime, so the most devastating pandemic that has a global impact, COVID. In the midst of COVID, illuminated even more so, was the sort of racial reckoning that we had to deal with. Right? So the police violence, state violence over Black bodies, particularly as George Floyd's murder magnified, began to create this movement, if you will, right? Re-energize a movement. And it's important to say re-energize as opposed to create, because create then suggests, again, that though Black women created Black Lives Matters, that we pay attention to it most when Black men get beat and brutalized. So I don't want to make that mistake. So it re-energized. Black Lives Matters, right? And so as we moved into this year, in January 6th happened the attack on the Capitol. So this sort of unraveling, if you will, our fragile democracy. The 2021 is also the 40th anniversary of AIDS. And AIDS in particular highlighted sort of the struggles. We didn't know that then. Those of us who are part of the community knew that, but the struggles around homophobia and its damage. You think about 1981, as Reagan becomes president, he ushers in sort of this new sort of political landscape of the Republican Party that was now no longer talking about small banks, less government, was more talking about global capitalization, or neoliberalism, privatizing, the cutting of social programs, and he was very silent around AIDS, right? Very silent around AIDS. In fact, when we think about Trump and the critique of Trump and his almost year ill response to it, Reagan allowed for 7 years that there'd be no response. So for 7 years, there was no response. And in the midst of that, 1984 ushered in the crack epidemic. And Black folk, because Reagan was cutting social programs, and we began to see the the mass incarceration of particularly of Black and brown bodies, the disproportionate synthesis between crack and coke impacting, again, Black and brown men bodies, male bodies, begin to organize around that. And we made a political and intentional decision to deal with crack and said not AIDS. Because if Black gay men were getting AIDS, Black gay men deserved it. It was God's way of getting rid of perversion from the earth. And it was Black gay men's punishment. And so Black gay men had to begin to organize in such a way, right? I think about gay men's health crisis was created in 1982, the very first community-based organization to be created in response to AIDS. And Black gay men began to feel that white gay men were not addressing sort of the needs, the particular needs of Black gay men. So they began organizing, creating things like Gay Men of African Descent in 1986, right? Creating things like Adodi, which was a spiritual sort of organizing group. Other countries, which was a political literacy group of Black LGBT folk. NMAC, National Minority AIDS Council. But here is sort of the resistant discourse and hegemony, right? Hegemony just means power. That even in discourses, even in movements and resisting against power over, winds up doing the same thing to those who are even more marginalized. So as communities, Black gay men begin organizing over against homophobia in Black community and what was perceived as white gay racism in relation to AIDS, use this notion of classism over the houseball community and begin to organize and ostracize the houseball community out of its organizing. And so houseball had to organize for itself, literally, because it couldn't go to these newly formed Black gay organizations because of classism. It wasn't white, so white gay organizing, and because of homophobia, it could not. So it had to really create itself, let alone it was at that moment, at that time, a predominantly, overwhelmingly working and poor young community. So folks began to die. And the community had to take care of itself, had to organize itself, began to migrate out of New York City in 1986 to Washington, D.C., to other cities like Philadelphia in 1989 and Baltimore in 1990, organizing with crack and AIDS, convening at one time in this community, but had no agency, right? Agency in the sense of a building, of a structure to advocate for itself, but had to find its own agency, its own body, its own community to advocate for its own self. And I think there's no other time during, at least in my lifetime, had I seen the houseball community having to do this, but under the guise of larger communities, just dying, absolutely having to collect any money that it could to bury people, right? To house people. And so this being the 40th anniversary is sort of a reminder of Dr. James Cone talks about God is with the oppressed. Paulo Freire talks about the pedagogy of the oppressed, that when those who are so marginalized are at the brink of annihilation, it becomes absolutely creative around its own survival. And in its creativity around its own survival, it creates pedagogical formulations around what it means to be human. To understand the notion of this title, what it really means to be human in this struggle for freedom, right? In the face of real catastrophe, death all day, every day, and nobody seemingly to care. Now, who do you go to? And so it's a reminder, I think, this year of all of those things. So these intersections of a 40th anniversary of AIDS in conversation with the global pandemic of COVID, in the midst of a racial reckoning around police violence, there's no other community to be able to talk about. Not only to be able to talk about, to be able to teach the world over about this. Last thing I say about this, to some degree, it's very interesting though, right? That as a tragedy occurred to George Floyd, around the same space, if you will, not too far in Minnesota, a trans woman, Black, named Ayanna, I can't think of her last name. I want to say Dior, but I could be wrong. Was being beat, right? Being beat in front of a store, drug out of a store. I think about 20 guys beating her. And somehow she had the hysterical, whether she knew it or not. So somehow the ancestors were in her, had the historical wherewithal to say, I'm going to drag my body back into the store. And if you're going to beat me and kill me, you're going to do it on a camera so it can be seen. So that the world over will know what happened, but not just to me, but to those who look like me all day, every day. You know, and that wherewithal is the relationships to Black freedom movement. You think about Emmett Till's mother, who in 1954 had to do the same exact thing to her son, who was beat by a gang of white men because of so-called whistling at a white woman, and so beaten, brutalized that was so unidentifiable. And the mother made the political intentional decision, had Black publications, Jet, Essence, I don't think Essence is around, so Jet, Ebony, to come take pictures, to archive, right, the funeral, and had an open casket and did nothing to the body, wouldn't do a change on the body, because she wanted the world over to know what happens to Black people all day, every day. Those things are, to me, are not accidental. These sort of moments, these freedom moments in the freedom movement, if you will. Because house ball is predominantly in the US context, Black and Latino. And I'm going to date myself and use the Latino versus Latinx and not say brown particularly. And I'll go back to why, excuse me, LGBT, which then says that every disparity that impacts Black folk are going to impact this community because it's Black, right? That every disparity impacts Latinos are going to impact this community because it's Latino. And that every disparity impact L folks, B folks, G folks, T folks impact this community because of all of those things. So here are all these disparities. Again, the use is language intentionally, converging and convening at the same exact time, right? All day, every day, right? Somehow the community continues to grow, continues to culturally produce, continues to theologize about what it means to matter, continues to politically organize around we have the right to live. So.
Thank you for that. You talked about, in this moment, we are at the intersection of anti-Blackness, where we have witnessed Black bodies brutalized and murdered. We're living in a police state, along with the global pandemic, putting a mirror on a healthcare system that creates health inequities and disproportionately impacts even more marginalized people, worse than just the general public. And we're also in the 40th year of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. So I just want to ask you a little bit more to expand upon, in this moment, for Ballroom teaching the world about being human, the struggle for freedom in the face of catastrophe.
So can you pause that?
Thank you for that. My next question is, Black prophetic tradition not only sees a way forward, but offers the necessary critique of the present moment. And this is the gift of Ballroom at its core. Ballroom has been courageous in daring to ask the question, in this moment of Black Lives Matter, which Black lives matter most?
It's part of the challenge with having in this moment to deal with high numbers of HIV. So in some ways, we've essentialized HIV so much within this community that it is not necessarily the priority, right? In fact, if you believe that it is your predisposition to become HIV positive, then that is absolutely not your priority to be HIV negative or live, right? So so it's the same thing with sort of defund the police. If for instance, this is the messiness of this dialogue at this moment we have to have, right? And so it's very challenging, I think, for instance, a Black trans to then engage in that dialogue with Black cis men and say, the police violence over me, we need to change sort of police are not only policing, but the brutality over Black men's bodies, that has to shift. Black men's women would then respond, well, you're probably right, but who we get beat by is you, right? Who we're not getting beat by necessarily is the police. Who I'm dying from is from the hands of Black cisgender men who then say they're heterosexual. And so we gotta have that murky conversation. I'm back into this notion that you asked around who lives matters most. We do it in a multiple way, in some ways. If we think historically around sort of the AIDS crisis, it's a wonderful documentary called How to Survive a Plague. And at the end of the documentary, sort of the ACT UP AIDS organizers were sitting around having a discussion around, they thought that their lot in life was to watch each other die. Everyone was passing away, so they thought that's exactly what's going to happen. And although we're organizing politically, it appears that people are still dying on our eyes. And so that we have to reconcile with the fact that is just going to be our destiny. And then they say in the documentary, and then we begin to live. And I remember watching it and said, who are the we that they were talking about? So what they meant was, because in 1996 was the creation from Merck Pharmaceuticals of the triple pill therapy that allowed folk who were HIV positive to go undetectable, right? And so you began to see sort of the prevalence and the incidence numbers, particularly with white gay men, go down. But who are the we that they were talking about? Why do I say that? It's 1996. 2001, they did an HIV prevalence study called Why MSM. Of course, MSM just means men with sex administered. Why is the young folk. And what came out of that study was the HIV prevalence studies, and this is CUNY grad school in terms, so I don't necessarily need to tell you what prevalence means, but prevalence just means how many people have it. And so what came out of that study was that 33%, one of the things that came out of that study was that 33% of African-American men who were sex men between the ages of 23 and 29 was HIV positive. Now that was a big deal for folk. Absolutely, the number, because at that time there was really probably no epi done on this community. So a lot of the things that we were going with was anecdotal. We knew, we are part of community, so we knew, and it was hard for us to justify that the numbers were in our communities, the disease burden was in our community, but the dollars were not there. This gave us sort of the justification. So that was 2001. Who were we were talking about? 2002 happened, and they did an incidence study. And incidence just means how fast an infection is growing. One of the things we know that in order we think about COVID, then we think about New York State, that Cuomo wanted the incidence of COVID, the positivity rate to be below 3%, right? And so one of the things that happened out of that YMSM2 study was that white men who had sex with men in that same age range between 23 and 29, the incident rate was about 1.5 to 2%. It's absolutely fabulous. So here is the we that they were talking about. Think about 96, Merck Pharmaceuticals, the triple pill therapy, undetectable, 1.5 to 2% about 6 years later.
absolutely wonderful. Not only because of the triple pill therapy, but there's some structural issues that we were not dealing with in terms of public health in relationship to HIV prevalence and incidence, race, class, and all those other things. For Latino men, or sex men in that same age range between 23 and 29, the incident rate was about 3.5 to 5%, which is faster than it needs to be. If we're looking at an elimination or leveling off an infection. In sub-Saharan Africa at that time, excuse me, where there was about 24 million people who were HIV positive, the incident rate was 6%, 3 times as fast as white MSMs. With African American men who were sex men, the incident rate was 13%, right? Twice as fast as sub-Saharan Africa. Who are the we that they were talking about? Right, 2003, they did a study on the houseball community, a prevalence study. And in New York City, what came out of that study was that 70% of houseball members in New York City was HIV positive. It's huge, particularly thinking of a marginalized community and within a marginalized community in a general location, so New York City. In 2005, they did another prevalence study, HIV prevalence study. It was called the CDC. It's a 5-city study and looked at New York City, Baltimore, Miami, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. And out of that study, no longer was the prevalence rate 33%, but now it was 46% of Black men were HIV positive. Who are the we that we're talking about? I can go on and on about other sort of epidemiological data, but the numbers have continued to increase, right? And so when you talk about whose lives matters most, when we're talking about sort of within a larger LGBT movement around AIDS, as white gay men numbers began to go down, you had very little dialogue around it outside of our community, with those who were doing the work within our community, right? And so now we're in a space where a lot of their voices around marriage equality and young Black gay men numbers continue to increase. In fact, in 2011, CDC put out for the very first time in the history of the epidemic that new HIV infection rates were on a decline, except for with Black gay men. There was a 48% increase. Who lives matters most? And so when you think about Black Lives Matters and sort of this political space in relationship to police violence, right? And as it was created, particularly in relationship to Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown, by these 3 Black women, 2 of them Black queer women, at the same moment were the increases in numbers of Black trans women beaten, brutalized, and murdered. But there was absolutely no outcry. So the question again, who lives matters most? And so I think that, again, this notion of a hegemony in resistant discourse, that if we don't get to a place that we are pushing beyond those hegemonic notions of power, of being, of mattering, if we don't have those kind of messy conversations, we're going to reinscribe the very oppression that we're fighting against. And so that, to me, this moment we have them at this moment in time, we have an opportunity to atone for, but to be able to get it right. And I think to your question, that in many ways the houseball community is the apt community to be able to effectively address. Right, it does have something to teach, has something to learn as well. Right, it has to be in dialogue with other global and historical struggles, but it absolutely has something to teach. Mostly, and not only, but mostly because it has been so marginal. Right, it has been so autonomous in its marginality in many ways. It borrows from other historical struggles, whether it's ACT UP, right? Whether it's sort of the Black gay movement around the AIDS crisis, whether you're thinking about civil rights or SNCC, I mean, it can borrow from so many other movements. And because it's so marginal, it really does have something to teach the world over. And because it's been doing the work, having to do the work. What's very interesting is that If, for instance, you go to a lot of these sort of community-based organizations that have been funded to do HIV prevention work, that a lot of the folk who are doing on the front line are doing the work are house ball members. And so this is one of the other reasons that I think house balls is more apt to be able to do this work.
Thank you so much for this meaningful discussion. Do you have any last thoughts or comments or anything else to add? And I do want to say defunding police, meaning reallocating resources to other community initiatives and things like that. So I'm sorry if I misspoke on that.
I think you did well. And the reason I said that, because I think if you ask the Ballroom, that language would have been used first and foremost. The notion of defunding, understandably, if you had said, we're talking about community-based organization, or the nonprofit industrial complex and its violence over house ball members would have said defund them. You understand it? Partly it's because of where they think the biggest threat is coming from. And so the notion of defunding has everything to do with, you got stuck. You got stuck.
I'm still stuck?
No, you're not stuck now.
Okay.
But the notion of defunding the language has everything to do with the threat. So it makes sense for that to come out of in relationship to police violence over particularly black cis men bodies. So it makes absolutely sense. That the Ballroom will probably say we need to reallocate, right? But if you were talking about the nonprofit industrial complex, the threat around the lives of house ball, in fact, the capital gain that these nonprofits seem to benefit from, then Ballroom probably would use that language. So that's the only reason I said that they probably would not use the language around defund the police, but reallocate.
Thank you. Yes, I just wanted to clarify that point. But beyond that, you just brought up another really important part around capitalism and how ballroom bodies have become and generate numbers for nonprofits and CBOs doing this work. And I just think that was a really important part for folks to take with them as we move into taking questions now. So, but do you have anything else you want to add before we go into the questions from the audience?
No, I appreciate this dialogue. I didn't realize it was done. You know, once I get going, I get going. And I appreciate this dialogue. I think it's an absolutely important dialogue to have, I think. I really do. I'm not saying it just to say it, but I really do think that's an important dialogue. I think Paulo Freire talks about sort of the importance of dialogical spaces, right? That has to be able to resist against the academy's notion of theory, right? That's the reverse of that is just to have talk, right? Let's just talk. But to be in dialogue, to place community's experience and understand its experience can theorize. In fact, it is the theory, it has the power to theory. I think that what you just did describe that. And I think that is absolutely sort of the work that House Ball is doing, whether it's House Lives Matters that you created and I helped you conceptualize, or the Ballroom Freedom School work, period. It does privilege sort of the lives of the House Ball community or folks within the community and their experiences over necessarily theoretical frameworks. But it places them in dialogue.
Absolutely. And it's our own grounded theory that we create and develop as we go through real time in real freedom movement and liberation movement through all of the reckoning that is happening. So thank you so much. And we'll move into questions from the audience now.
Thank you. Wow. I don't know about you, but
if you work in a team, you should be using Monday.com. It's a platform to manage any team and any workflow. Market.
Sorry, let me make sure that I close that out. Thank you so much. This was, I almost forgot to hit the button because I was so wrapped up in the conversation. It gives me real pleasure to open the floor to Dr. Lee and now Dr. Roberson. Thank you so much for this conversation. I have to say, Dr. Lee, I am blown away as usual. Michael, you did not lie. She is phenomenal and getting better every day. So, Dr. Lee, if you want to unmic yourself.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I have to admit, you saw some bloopers. We wanted to, we're family, Michael and I, so we were having a conversation, but we want to set the stage with more of an interview style so you could just hear from this brilliant, beautiful Black man, Michael Roberson. As we're going to do a 3-part series, this is a good one for others who can't join us tonight to go back and watch and have some grounding, if you will, to have a conversation around ballroom liberation and freedom. So I see Dale. Oh, actually, Michael, would you like to also say hello to the group? And then I see Dale has their hand up.
Yeah, it's so, one of the things I cannot stand is watching me on videos. I think I'm just absolutely so melodramatic in my affect. That's number one. But two, also in this moment we are with virtual sort of reality in terms of having to do things virtually. The bloopers were sort of driving me crazy. But I was wondering as we no, not for you, for us. The bloopers for me, particularly because of the getting stuck. But I thought to myself, Jennifer, for folks who may not know what the house walk community is, so difficult to talk about it. We should have started with maybe the video of House Lives Matters PSA. Maybe that would have been a better way to also begin.
Share it
We'll
after.
be sure to include that.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Deborah, for providing space for us to have a conversation with community tonight. We're so happy to partner with you. And so we want to express our gratitude to you. So I see Dale's hand is up. So if you would like to unmute and ask your question, that would be great. Thank you.
Hello there. Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are.
Fantastic. So family, thank you so much for this. It's bittersweet. I was a physician assistant and I literally was kind of thrown into the fire of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, worked in the first HIV/AIDS designated bed hospital, St. Clair's, and would walk over crack vials to get to work every day. And so the gallows humor every Monday was, so, ha ha ha, who's not here anymore? And it wasn't because we didn't, I didn't know I was going to feel this way. And it wasn't because we didn't care about our patients, but it was a little much. Back then, there was only AZT that you could throw at them, and with alarm clocks telling them how often they should take it. And as I don't have to tell you this, it wasn't working too good. So I can relate so much. And one of the persons in Paris is Burning was a patient there on our floor and unfortunately did pass while there. So there was so much that interconnected myself as a Black woman and being there because I wanted to understand and be in the struggle against HIV/AIDS. And then it took a swing from being primarily white and then being more of the people that were either addicted to drugs or using drugs in order to have a lifestyle that they wanted to have. And then it became women of childbearing age. And don't even start talking about the African women who were sold from their continent to ours in exchange for various things so that their family could be more secure there. But obviously that meant that the person that bought them here was not going to be supportive of them or in any way their health. So the woman that was newly placed here and just purchased to have money given to her home is now here and becomes positive. So the kind of transitions or iterations that age made in the populations at that time were my patients, and it was a humbling experience. My gosh, to see, to have evidence right in front of your eyes, who and how and when, and oh, so these people are not thought to be important. So these people are next because, and they're disposable. So much of what you said is that bittersweet remembrance of that and the connectedness. And so thank you once again for that and being able to put that in such a way that I imagine everyone can understand it. One of the things that I just knew that was the good side was that I will never again see a patient or a friend or anyone I know being spat upon or beaten up because people thought that person brought in an epidemic. I'm like, yay, this is the good thing about this. When this is over, I'll never see it again. And well, I guess I lived too long because here we are, right? And you have Asian people who are being treated in the way that I thought I would not live to see again. Just like you said, Reagan refusing to mention the words until he had to. I don't know, maybe two people dropped dead in front of him and he thought, press conference, got to say something. I don't know what it was, but he finally turned. And the same thing with the orange orangutan. But I would like to say that now I do personally, unfortunately, personally, have so many of those things tied in with me. I'm a senior, disabled woman, LGBTQ, and I've got to contend with things like that. My aide exposed me to COVID because she didn't have the education from the capitalistic agency that hired her to protect her so she could know that being COVID positive isn't a good thing. And it didn't allow her to know that she shouldn't come to work to protect me when she's positive, because you can't protect someone like that. I mean, what kind of criminy stuff is that? So again, they didn't teach her, they didn't tell her she's a brown person, I'm a Black person. We know the things I said about me. She has 2 kids at home. Now she's positive and figures, well, I don't really have to tell anyone or the agency I work for because it's all good.
Thank you, Dale, for sharing your.
I'm going on, I'm sorry. I'll stop.
It's okay, thank you.
And Dale, you said some wonderful things that you looped. My good friend Lisa, whose home I'm at right now, calls it a loop. That wonderful loop that you did around never in your lifetime would you have thought that you would have to witness. So that would be the last moment of people being spat on. And that loop you did to make a connection to COVID and Asian folk, right? That was so wonderful. Let me back into that real quick. There's a woman named Emily Towns, Black woman. I was blessed to go to Union Theological Seminary and be a student of womanist theology that was created by Black women in 1985. And there's a womanist theologian, ethicist named Emily Towns. And she talks about memory can be an emancipatory praxis. How we remember is absolutely so important. And so the notion of you remembering that moment and making that connection to this moment and almost saying, have we learned the lesson yet? right? Have we learned it yet? Cornel West talks about the Black freedom movement. If we haven't learned the lesson, all it means is just that we've gotten old, but we haven't matured. So we've gotten old and we haven't matured. So thank you so much, Dale, for that loop and how you remember that.
Yes, Dale, I would also love to mention this. You said something, bittersweet remembrance. And when COVID first hit, all we saw were just bodies and nowhere to put them and no way to celebrate and remember people. And the beauty of our community is coming together in those moments to ensure that we celebrate those lives and make sure we value those lives and continue in their legacies and bring a piece of them along with us. But that loop that Michael was just speaking about is so powerful too, because who would have thought that you'd see the HIV/AIDS epidemic and then you see COVID pandemic, you know, in your lifetime, to understand that, you know, maybe we haven't learned just yet, but, you know, it put a mirror on disparities being and continuing to be in communities of color, primarily Black. And that's a problem. And where is the outcry? It just continues to be that the numbers that tell the story is the disparities are real and they continue to hit certain communities. But, you know, there's just not been the outcry that there needs to be. And yes, there's been visibility of it, but still not enough to be done to actually mitigate them or address them, you know, impactfully or with impact and meaning. So thank you.
Any other questions? Comments? Dr. Jones, I see you there. Reverend Jones, I see you hanging in the corner there. Yes, Mohammed, would you like to unmic?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thank you for that really enlightening interview. I think it was Dr. Lee that said something about CBOs and nonprofits using the bodies of the community ballroom. I wonder, and pardon me if I missed it, if there's any organizations that are run by communities, by the ballroom community, that are organizing in various ways.
Yeah, I did say that Dr. Lee said it, but I don't want to indict all community-based organizations or not. And it's really, let me say two things. It really is not necessarily CBOs, right? The notion of a CBO is when we change the trajectory. So in the beginning of the epidemic, we created organizations to be based around community needs, CBO, right? But then when we began to become non-profits and not-for-profits, which just means that you can't sell your service for profit. But what you can do is build empire, profit off the pain of marginalized people. So that to me is that separation. So there are some CBOs who do great work, and so I don't want to indict. But to your particular point, there are a couple. One in New York City, my great friend, Dr. Lee's great friend, the icon, Sean Coleman Ebony, created Destination Tomorrow in the Bronx. Sean is not only a Black trans man, but he is also an icon in the house ball community. So that's one. And there are also projects Dr. Lee created and brought me in and brought my good friend Martha Chono Helsley in, and she created House Lives Matters National Leadership Initiative that began in 2016 and now is in its 5th year of organizing ballroom nationally and developing leadership. There have been things like the Albert Santana Ballroom Freedom School Project, which was named after our great, no longer here, Albert Santana, who was one of the first ones to do community organizing and ballroom. A group of what we call organic intellectuals or ballroom leaders, and the idea of creating sort of pedagogical response. There's KBCAM, which is Keeping Ballroom Community Alive Network. There is Ballroom We Care. that was created by my great two friends, Mike Haynes, and Timothy Tobias, that looks at particularly house ball organizing around crystal meth epidemic. So there are a whole bunch of things, projects, and a couple of community-based organizations that's grounded in community, to the ethos of the ballroom community. But I'll mention a couple other two that are not, but that are great. And I'm not saying it because I have a critique, but because I do believe it. The HEAT program, in which Jennifer was the deputy executive director, and the executive director is Dr. Jeff Birnbaum out of Brooklyn, does amazing programming for particularly with the house ball community, and so does Housing Works in Brooklyn, and so does GMHC and the Latex Project, and so they're there. And in Dallas, Texas, my great friend Kirk Myers created the very first and only indigenous Black gay organization in the state of Texas, Abounding Prosperity. And one of the things he created along with me was the Ball House and Pageant Conference that looks at the intersection of the house ball community and the pageant community in the regional South. So there are quite a few things.
And Muhammad, thank you for that, Michael. And in working in a CBO nonprofit, everything is about the numbers. How many people did you reach with this intervention? How many people? Oh, the more people you reach, the more money you can get, right? The more people that are sicker and poor and their health is not well, the more money you can get. And to me, I just saw the capitalism in the system being created in some ways, but I knew that being in the position of power that I was, you could actually do something real with that and not just have an HIV test, but you could offer an intervention, a homegrown intervention from Ballroom that Michael runs, which is like a 3MV, many men, many voices, adapted for the house and ballroom community, right? Like cultural responsive interventions, intraventions, which I say are grown from the community, being offered to people that really impact their lives in a different way. And I guess it was just me sitting in that position, writing grants and realizing how much of this is such the nonprofit industrial complex where body, money, numbers, and it's like this system that runs, and the better grant writers you have, the more capacity you have, the more money you get, but the more grass tops you get instead of grassroots, right? So, and all these beautiful spaces that Michael just named, they're beautiful partners. It's Ballroom organizing within itself, for itself, by us, for us, in every way to make sure that we provide these culturally responsive services. Think about that nonprofit industrial complex in ways, but make sure that there's meaningful spaces for people of this lived experience and of this community. So I just want to back into why I said it, but it's been something that's hung on to me so much because you realize what these systems and then the people that put the grants out, what they're looking for. And it's like a system, it's a game, it's a system of like, wow, like the more people you reach that are sicker and poorer and Blacker and younger, and it's just like it was a terrible kind of thing to think about in the moment. So thank you for lifting that question. I hope I was clear in what I'm trying to say, but it really made me think differently about why House Lives Matter needed to be born as a space where we could go beyond HIV. We need to think about the social justice movements. We need to think about human rights. We have people who are immigrants and intersect with so many different spaces. So it's like, how do we abolish ICE? How do we decriminalize sex work? The topics became more complex and larger, and there's no space like Ballroom is the space where these dialogues are happening constantly. And so as Michael always says, Ballroom really does have something to teach the world about being free and liberated and being human and valued. So that's my kind of rebuttal for that.
Yeah, and last thing I'll add to that. Oh, sorry, Muhammad. I'm sorry.
I said thanks. I see that you also listed some of those websites, which I will definitely visit. But I guess I did want to kind of follow up a little bit more. Mm-hmm. The reason why I asked is because I've also worked at many nonprofits as a social worker, and then I finally left, and I'm in private practice as a therapist. So I'm kind of like really interested in connecting with these programs to see if there is a need for like trauma healing, trauma therapy that's like provided by Black LGBT plus practitioners. So that's kind of like the context behind that.
There's absolutely, so the unforgotten work we've done, we have not done, is this work around mental health with trauma and healing. There's an absolute big need for that. And you oftentimes, if you go to a ball, it is oftentimes played out in real time. You can see it. And so we have not done the great work around intersecting sort of HIV prevention and other health disparities with mental health. So absolutely there's a need for that, absolutely. Last thing I will also add to the list of organizations that we were talking about. You know, what's so interesting is you heard me and Dr. Lee talk around at the beginning of Black gay men, particularly organizing, creating organizations to deal with the epidemic, it ostracized house ball. And including in many ways when we created Black Prides. Today, there are a number of house ball members who are running Black Prides now. So Lee Soldier, for instance, in New York City runs Black Pride. Brandon Anthony, who is in the House of Garçon, lives in LA. He runs Black Pride. Alvernia Rafiq runs Black Pride in Norfolk. And so you're beginning, Kwame Banks, who was no longer running Black Pride in Boston, was running Black Pride in Boston. And so to the very least of these, always the ones who are the ones who oftentimes bring redemption for everybody else. So very interesting how the tides have changed.
We'll also make sure that when we send out the link for this recording, we'll make sure that we put those links for those organizations in the email also. So you don't have to worry about trying to hurry up and scoop them up.
Is there a way to follow up with either of you via email? Is it listed anywhere?
Sure, we can share it in the chat for sure, and we'll make sure Deborah has our information as well to share.
Thank you.
Yes, it'll be in the email that we send out. You have another question here from Betty Levin. Betty, would you like to unmute or would you like me to read your question? So the question reads, can you talk a little bit about, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I can unmute. I wondered, I know something about the ballroom movement because I know some of Jennifer's work, and so much of the spirit of that movement seemed to be bringing people together in families in the houses. And I wondered how the movement had been affected over the last year plus with COVID, if it's appropriate to talk about it here.
It's absolutely appropriate. The question is absolutely poignant. It's a timely question. You know, last night, me and Dr. Lee was on another dialogue with some wonderful people around some of the same things that you are lifting up, Dr. Levin. And I thought about, as 2020 entered, there's a woman named Dr. Jackie Lewis who was the very first woman and the very first African-American to be pastor of Middle Collegiate Church, and that burnt actually. But in their 300-year history, and they do an annual conference. And last year they had to, because of COVID, had to do their conference virtually. And she asked if I and Dominique Jackson, who plays a lecture on Pose, could be in dialogue on the conference to talk about what this ballroom had to say in this moment of COVID. And we had the conversation, and I realized that because ballroom in almost every geographical region in the country where there's a ballroom community, there's a coalition of leaders, right? So there's a West Coast Ballroom Coalition, there's Atlanta, New York, New Jersey, there's one in Dallas. And these coalitions have Facebook pages and forums. And every house in the ballroom community also has a Facebook page and forum. And so when COVID happened, the work that we were doing just translated virtually. We were doing mental health checkups. We were doing house meetings virtually. They were doing virtual balls. And so the work so the work continued effectively because of the infrastructure of the house ball community. Now, I'll be real quite honest, New York City, because of its particular stance around COVID and COVID safety, in New York State, there were no balls in New York that happened over the past year. In fact, we haven't had a ball in New York City since last February. But other states who were looser, particularly Georgia, there were a lot of balls in the height of the epidemic. And what I begin to realize, ballroom folk in the South, or who went to balls in the South, particularly in Atlanta, had a false sense of security. They thought that these balls were not potentially super spreaders because there was no numbers coming out of it. And I said, no, that's not the case. It's just that your state doesn't have robust contact tracing. So there's no contact of tracing it. And so you believe that COVID is not there is no COVID transmission happening at these spaces just because there's been no report. Given that, we've now, as we are coming out of sort of the loosening more so of the restrictions, this is some of the things that we're going to have to be able to address, because there's certain geographical regions like New York who has not had a ball, has been much more I think effective in dealing with COVID in relationship to house ball than other spaces, and being able to give them technical assistance around how to do that.
Hi, Dr. Levin. It's so nice to hear your voice. And you are a great part of my journey while I was working on my ballroom dissertation. And Michael, of course, was such a supporter outside of the school, but a huge part of my journey. And so thank you for your question. I just want to say that the community just can pivot so quickly. And when COVID hit, we figured out every means and mechanism to be connected in this cyborg heaven, if you will, of virtual realities on all kinds of different social media platforms. People were utilizing that to, sustain their own lives, generate income through places like Bigo, and have virtual balls, and really adapt and adopt our best practices in a new way. And we had to have a new reality because we could not physically be together, which is like a huge piece of ballroom's resiliency, love, and being in support and family, is like having that physical close proximity with one another. So it's still a very hard shift right now to not have been able to hug Michael in months, or see some of Genovia, all these people that I love as much as we can. The other thing is, with House Lives Matter, as part of the community, we created a mutual aid fund, and we raised over $20,000 and provided money back to community members who were in need. And we heard a lot about their not being able to, pay their bills and their phone bills, their internet. There were a lot of reasons why they applied for aid and relief, and we were able to provide that back. So I guess to your question, it's really, we know how to pivot and move so quickly, because that's a part of the resiliency and survival of this community. And it says, when the systems fail us, we'll find every way to get around it and survive and do what we do. And so I think that is like our biggest lesson learned over the past year plus. And we continue to just organize, I think the Brooklyn Liberation March for Black trans power and Black trans people was one of the largest protests in our history. It's insane to think about, but really led by beautiful Black, powerful trans women who have always historically been at the forefront of our social movements and liberation movements. And it just, in the midst of a pandemic, they're like, oh, protesters are going to, spread COVID everywhere, going to protest. None of that happened. We were all masked up. We were all in love with each other. We all found ways to still celebrate our joy and love for each other, and to stand up for justice and liberation and rights in the midst of a global pandemic. We had so much loss. It was like continuous loss. And so while we're constantly grieving, there's also so much hope. And I think that was like the tension we were living in through this past year and a half. But you know, it's really about pivoting, adapting, and adopting, and we were really able to do that quickly. And I think that is the beauty and brilliance of Ballroom, is to always find a way when there's no way, you know. And you know, that's kind of what I would say to your answer, because I did defend my dissertation in the midst of the pandemic as well. So those pictures of joy were previous to that, but you know, in that moment, we were trying to figure out ways to think of new ways of being in a world that we had never experienced before.
Definitely. Thank you for that. Any other questions, comments? So, Michael, can you share with me what your thoughts are about what's next? What do we do now? We are coming out of this pandemic, but we are still swirling and in the intersection of so many other issues. What's next?
Yeah, you know, that's probably one of my response would be that if you ask Ballroom that, Ballroom probably would say there is no next, right? That we've not stopped to concentrate just on one thing, that we've always continued, right? And so I don't know. So I don't know how to answer that, I gather is what I'm really saying. I really don't know how to answer that. I do know, though, that I think, as we said in the interview, that the way that Ballroom has been historically able to organize, it does have something to teach. So maybe the next is around the thing that you provided for us today, was really to have Ballroom in dialogue with other communities. I think the thing that Jennifer is doing, Dr. Lee is doing around this sort of three-part dialogue is the next, right? Is having Ballroom in dialogue with other communities, because I do think that it's a protocol. Absolutely has a protocol. Now, that doesn't mean that Ballroom knows it all. It has to, but it does have something to teach and to share. So I hope I answered that question, because that is a difficult question. I don't know what the next is, except for that we just keep it moving and we just keep it organizing.
Oh, I think that was the perfect answer. It is about continuing the dialogue, creating spaces where we can have honest, true conversations about the hard issues. Dr. Lee? I see you shaking your head. Yes.
This question, and that I was actually going to pose that to Michael as part of our closing at some point, but thank you, Deborah. I think it is a really hard question, because I was speaking with Michael last night, and we're just in this moment where all these things are merging together. It's like this beautiful chaotic space where we have anti-Blackness, anti-Asian racism, ending of a pandemic, like fingers crossed. I don't want to say it's ending, but moving into a new part of post-pandemic living, experiencing. Lots of things to do around mass like there's so many things I could list in this moment, and I think that is one of the hardest questions. Is you think about like the Spanish flu, and after that came the Renaissance, and that's where Ballroom was born. In the 1920s, the Roaring 20s happened. So I think this is going to be a really exciting time of, I would say, new abolitionists and people who are very conscious and aware of the world and are ready to shake it up, whatever that is, hopefully for the better, and hopefully to leave a world behind that is changed. That's my answer. I don't know. I can't answer that. It's a weird place. Like, I think we're all trying to figure it out in the moment as well. And just like Michael said, just keep it moving and keep living boldly, unapologetically in our truths, and just doing all of that and making sure our stories are told and shared and valued at the same time.
Well, you should know that you will always have a place here to share those stories, and to have those hard conversations. And that is a commitment that I say to you on the record. And so you can hold me to that anytime. We will always not only bring a chair to the table, but we'll make our own tables so that we can have our own conversations, to ensure that not only are we clearing the way going forward, but that we're also reaching behind to make sure that we're bringing everyone with us in that process. So, Dr. Lee, I'm going to give you back your floor because, as usual, I can find my way into moderating really quickly. So I'm going to decrease so that you can continue to shine and increase.
Oh, thank you, Deborah. And uh, we've had a long history and so much great times in the work. So I really appreciate you. I want to ask another question to Michael, since we have you here. Since we filmed or recorded our session, Billy Porter and his story was shared, Pose has ended. And I guess in this moment, I really think about like, what will it take to end the HIV epidemic? But beyond that is kind of like what Deborah was mentioning, is what's next in terms of like what's not being talked about in this moment that we should be thinking about. You know, I know you always talk about theology and its intersection with epidemic, catastrophe, and crisis. And so I'd be interested to hear that lens in this moment.
I mean, I think that is the beauty of this moment, right? That it has us talking about all of these things. That is the beauty, I think, of this moment. I remember when 2020 came in, I called it the year of the perfect vision. And this is before, so obviously this was in January, right? And so February happens in March and we closed down. But part of having perfect vision is having to shed itself of an old, outdated way of looking at things, right? The death of something is the birth of something else. And because we had to take a global pause, because the universe at one time told everyone to pause. And I just believe that because of that, we were to ponder on three propositions. One is a philosophical one. The philosophical proposition is, who do we desire to be? Right. So as we pause, we can choose who we want to be, how we show up in the universe now. The second one is a theological one, which is, how do we desire to love and love more expansively, particularly the work that we do. That, think about James Baldwin and his notion of the love ethic. If love is not ingrained as part of the foundation of the work that we do, it's a moot conversation, right? Public health, I've always said that public health does not save people. It knows how to manage crisis. Knows how to manage crisis. But if you know how to manage crisis, then suggests that crisis will always be, right? And so you have to organize community. ACT UP was not a public health initiative, right? It was a community organizing initiative addressing a public health crisis, which takes me to my third proposition, which is the political one, which is, how do we move away from politically organizing around the right not to die and move towards the right to live? Marginalized people have been told, you have the right not to die, so you're not supposed to be beat by the police. No, I'm supposed to be able to walk down the street in peace. Those are two separate trajectories. I'm supposed to have it. So that to me is what this moment, and because of all of these things that are happening at the same time, that's nothing but the universe of getting rid of old structures. Birthing process is always painful. And so that, to me, that is this moment. So I don't know if there's nothing that we're not talking about. That is the beauty of it. It's so discursive at this moment. Yeah, I wish we had longer time, or with me and you had thought about it, because I would have shown, talking about Ballroom and how it uses, I call it, you talked about theology, the body as a hermeneutics, as a way to minister. That's a homiletics, but as a way to contextualize pain and joy and all this other stuff. I talk about how lip sync performance was one of those things, how Vogue is one of those things. But I have a young Black Latino gay man who happens to be my son, who is a poet, also in the ballroom community, and he's a voguer. And he was born in New York, moved to Florida with his mother. His mother's new man had no space for him because he was gay. So his mother had to send him back up to New York to live with his uncle in Long Island and his uncle's wife. And so they knew that he was gay. And so that, I guess the uncle caught him one day, had a guy in his room, and they knew that he was gay, but they didn't want that in his house. And the uncle says to him, you know, you have to move because my wife doesn't want this in my home. And so my son said, okay, well, give me to the end of the week. Well, the uncle then went allegedly and told the rest of the family that he was gay, but added something that was not true, which was that he was HIV positive. So he left that very night, and he had to live on the trains in New York and in the park. And he met, this is a little while ago, an older Black gay man on Black Gay Chat, which was one of those websites. The guy asked him out to eat and to go to movies. They went to dinner and it was too late to go to the movies. So the guy invited him back to his room to chill. And when they get back to the room, the guy calls two other friends and they beat and they rape and brutalize him. And he uses his poetry. Here's a hermeneutics of the body. He uses his poetry to not only theologize that he mattered, but to be cathartic, to deal with Muhammad's notion of trauma and pain. And I wanted to show that video, what have you. I didn't think about it until we were just talking, so.
Well, we have 2 more parts to our series, and we can completely adapt and move how we need to. And I think that would be a great exercise to show the videos, and you do that thing you do. With that said, I see Arnold's also here. I just want to say hi.
Hey, Icon.
Yes, hi to Icon Arnold, who's also part of our House Lives Matter leadership committee and team. Just it's been so monumental in a lot of the work, community organizing work we've done.
How do you know there's Arnold, Lower St. Laurent, just as Arnold's iPhone? It could be any Arnold.
I know Arnold. We're on enough Zooms. I know it's Arnold's iPhone. I know it's Arnold. But I know we have a couple minutes left, and I just want to say one thing to close. And Michael, you can, say a thing to close, and then Deborah, you can let us know if that's okay. But I just, one of the things I kept saying to myself over this time is the safest community is an organized one, and that is my kind of last line of the evening. And Michael, I'll pass it to you.
No, I don't know how to end. I'm like Patti LaBelle, all right? Don't know how to end. Hey, Arnold. Don't know how to end Over the Rainbow. But I'll be brief, just with gratitude. Want to thank both Deborah and yourself for having this conversation and opening up this space. And grateful for everyone who have all come on to be part of the dialogue. So thank you.
It is such an honor and a privilege. The space is always open to you. I'm going to hold you to those videos and the stories that go with them. I thank you for your time, your energy, your talents, your sharing of your wisdom. Dr. Lee, it has been, as always, an honor and a privilege to watch you grow from working at HEAT and going through all the phases of now being a leading researcher and convening this important conversation. I simply ask folks to please fill out the poll that's in the chat. It helps us in terms of planning further. I want to say thank you all for trusting us and allowing us to take up your time this evening. But most of all, for all the work that you do for working with our communities, for being open for the hard conversations. And on behalf of the School of Public Health and Health Policy, we wish you all a fabulous evening. I'm going to stop the recording. I will stay on a little longer, but please know this link will be shared with you both on Facebook. It will be part of our channel for our YouTube, so you will receive all of that. And thank you.
Thank you.